Hello and welcome to Talk Truth. My name is Corey Huntsberger. I've got my father, Alan Huntsberger, in the studio, and we're going to be doing our foundational verse.
The earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord. For he laid its foundation on the seas and established it on the rivers. Psalms 24, 1 and 2.
Important verse to establish this and get the foundation of this show because it's going to be an interesting show. Alan, your thoughts on that verse?
Well, it basically says in 1 Peter 1, 5 that you are being protected by God's power through faith for a salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. And that to me speaks tons of not only where we're at in our history, but it also speaks of God's protection when we come to salvation. And that's because he protects his people. And I love that because you're going to hear a testimony that, found God's protection and totally turned him around. But before he found God's protection, he was a victim.
Yeah.
And what a disaster that was.
Yeah, let's bring on our guest, Mr. Shawn Buckley is back. Hey, Shawn, welcome back to the show.
Oh, so glad to be back. Just a pleasure.
Shawn, I'm going to go ahead and let you tee up what we're going to watch because we promised everyone that we'd be playing some NCI testimony that you did in Edmonton just recently. Are the children in Canada safe? And I'm going to go ahead and let you tee up what we're going to watch today.
Yeah, this is compelling. So this is Theo Fleury. Won an Olympic gold medal, won a Stanley Cup with the Flames, won a World Junior medal. I think he's 10th all-time WHL scoring and 61st for all-time NHL scoring. So we know him as the big hockey player. But if you recall, he had severe addiction problems and anger issues, and he got kicked out of the NHL. And basically, he became a completely broken person. He was describing how he found himself with a loaded pistol in his mouth. He didn't pull the trigger. But shortly after that, on September 17th, 2005, he's basically on his hands and knees in a bathroom. And he's disheveled, and he's at the end of his rope. And he makes a decision to give his life over to God. And like the addiction's gone. Like it's been 19 years without any alcohol or drugs since then, and God's used him to start basically healing people who have had trauma. And this is compelling testimony. It's funny, he's on the stand and I'm the one leading him, and he's going on and on and on, and it's just the Holy Spirit saying, don't interrupt, let me let me speak. And we find out afterwards that he had been praying before he came onto the stand that God would speak through him, and boy, did God speak through him.
This is the first time I've heard his testimony and his story. I know he's written a book about it. Fascinating, very, very similar to mine. Pistol in the mouth, going to commit suicide in a bathroom. God gets a hold of you, and the next day, taking away the addictions and the drugs and the alcohol and all that. Fascinating testimony. Watch this.
First of all, thank you for asking me to come and speak. My first experience with trauma came as a child. Both my parents experienced childhood trauma in their life. And then that manifested itself into addictions. My dad was an alcoholic. My mom was a prescription pill addict. And so I grew up in a home that was, there was lots of chaos, lots of drama, some violence. And so basically from the time I was 5 years old until now, I've made every major decision in my life on my own because of the trauma I experienced as a kid. And, there was a lot of nights where I would sit at home and wait to see what kind of father was going to show up. Was it going to be the ugly drunk, or was it going to be the happy drunk? And I hope most times, it would be the happy drunk. But on the occasions that, the bad drunk showed up, I had to protect my mother who was, chronically depressed, was on that wonder drug in the 60s called Valium, which they gave to pretty much every type of whatever it was. And so she got addicted right away. And so, that was my first experience with trauma. And then, I started playing hockey around the same time and, fell head over heels in love with hockey because it was my happy place. It was my escape. If I was at the rink, I didn't have to be at home and I didn't have to deal with, with all the craziness that was going on in my house, and quickly discovered I was really good at the game. And so, I spent the majority of my childhood, developing this, talent that I had. And so, my mom would often say, I'm just going to move your bed down to the rink because that's where you are most of the time. And I was very fortunate to grow up in a little town called Russell, Manitoba. And when I moved there when I was 6 years old, it just so happened that the 13 best athletes in this little town of Russell, Manitoba were all 6 years old and were all my age, right? And I would spend the next 9 years playing with these same 13 kids. And not only that, but we had 3 incredible fathers who became our coaches, became our mentors, and instilled some incredible morals and values. And we were a very successful team. In the 9 years I was there, we won 3 provincial championships in hockey and 3 provincial championships in baseball with the same 13 guys, same 3 coaches. And so around the age of 12, scouts started to come watch me play. And then when I was 14 years old, I was part of the very first Bantam draft that was held in the Western Hockey League. And I got picked in the 2nd round by the Winnipeg Warriors, who are now the Moose Jaw Warriors. And so the summer after I got drafted, the guy that discovered me, the guy that scouted me, came to my parents' house and basically sat my mom and dad around the kitchen table and basically said, we think Theo needs better competition, better coaching, and we'd like for him to move to Winnipeg. And so when I was 15 years old, I moved to Winnipeg, and needless to say, that choice and that decision would change me for the rest of my life. Because over the next 2.5 years, this particular coach and scout, and I won't name him, raped me 150 times over a 2.5-year period. And so what I was left with was a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and there wasn't one person in the world I could have told. Because I knew if I tried to tell, first of all, I wouldn't be believed, and then second of all, I knew that would be the end of my hockey career because I would be labeled as a liar, a cheater, So I kept this secret inside for 27 years. And I too quickly became addicted to all different kinds of things. And about 20 years ago, I had a fully loaded pistol in my mouth, ready to pull the trigger and end my life because I was completely exhausted from living in emotional pain and suffering for the majority of my life. And then, but, I went on to have this amazing hockey career, you name it, all these accolades, all this stuff. And then in 2003, I got kicked out of the NHL because I couldn't stop drinking. I couldn't stop doing drugs, and my behavior was completely out of control. And then September 17th of 2005, I found myself in a washroom on my hands and knees. And I knew that if I continued down the road that I was going on, that I was going to die the alcoholic addict death, which was going to be a very painful, lonely, angry, miserable death. And And so I ended up in a washroom on my hands and knees, and I was very physically distraught, crying, disheveled. And I reached out to God that night, and I asked him to take away the obsession to drink and do drugs. And I turned my will and my life over to the care of him that evening. And the next morning I woke up, and that was the last time I've had a drink and a drug, which was like 19 years ago. And basically turned my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand him, and he granted me sobriety. And then, it was interesting because, I'd focused my whole entire life, trying to become a professional hockey player. And I thought that this was going to last the rest of my life. And here I was, I think I was 36 years old, and all I had was a grade 12 diploma from Vanier Collegiate in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and had more than half of my life left to live and had no idea what the rest of my life was going to look like. And so I got involved with the Calgary Flames alumni after, and we do tons of charity work, and we loan our names to different causes. And isn't it funny, the first event I attended was a golf tournament, and sure enough, the first guy I meet at this golf tournament is an old media guy that used to cover the team when I played there, and I hadn't seen him in I don't know how many years. And first thing he said to me, he says, "What are you doing these days?" I said, "I'm doing absolutely nothing." And so we kind of go back and forth, and we make small talk. And at the end of the conversation, I say to him, I go, "Do you know anybody that'd be interested in writing a book with me?" And he said, "Funny you should ask." He says, "My wife is a writer." And I was like, "Oh, wow, this is kind of serendipitous and whatever." So 3 days after that conversation, I met with Kirsty, and then 3 days later, we started writing this book, Playing with Fire. And when I sat down to write the book, the only thing I was going to talk about was my hockey career. I wasn't going to talk about my parents. I wasn't going to talk about my sexual abuse. I wasn't going to talk about my drink-a-log and my drug-a-log. I was just going to talk about my hockey career. But early on in the process of writing this book, this lady who I was writing the book with, she made me feel safe, and I trusted her. And then all of a sudden, it was just like I was throwing up on the pages of this book that I was writing and telling the whole entire story from start to finish. And so 3.5 years later, we finished the book, and I tell the whole story from start to finish. And 4 days before I was going to Toronto to launch this book, like, I was scared and I was afraid because I didn't know how all of you were going to react to what was in this book, right? But I also knew that I was going to go do a whole bunch of media surrounding this book, and I knew that the only thing that the media would be interested in would be to re-victimize me at every opportunity they would get. And so, me being a pretty smart and bright guy, I spent 4 days on my computer researching every single thing I could find on the subject of child sexual abuse, because I wanted to get a story of hope and healing and recovery and all these messages out to the public. And, there was one shocking thing that I discovered in my research was this stat. 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys will have some sort of unwanted sexual experience before the age of 18. And I'm like, that's like 2/8. 2/8 is 1/4. 1/4 into the population of Canada. That means there's over 10 million survivors in this country. And so this is all going somewhere, so I'll just try to go as fast as I can.
There's no rush.
Okay. So here I was, I did 300 interviews the first 4 days I was in Toronto. I did TSN, Sportsnet, every magazine, every newspaper, every morning radio show, TV show. And just like I predicted, the only thing they were interested in was the gory details of my sexual abuse. But I'd spent 25 years in the media being interviewed every single day as a professional athlete. So I knew that I didn't have to answer the reporters' questions directly, right? So I took over every interview, and I had all this information. I had all this stuff about child sexual abuse. And so I got all these messages out there that, you know, this could possibly be the biggest epidemic on the planet. And why is nobody talking about child sexual abuse? You know what I mean? And so I got this incredible message out there. And then the next thing on the docket was the first book signing. And I can tell you that my expectations were like really low. I was like, nobody's going to read this book, you know? And I'm not Wayne Gretzky. I'm not Mario Lemieux. I'm not Mark Messier. You know, had a great career, but, you know, not like these guys. So I fully expected to show up and sign 10 books, go to the next town, sign 10 books, you know, so on and so forth. Well, I show up at the biggest Indigo chapter store in all of Canada, downtown Toronto, 3 levels. And I walk through the front doors of the bookstore, and there's 400 people standing in line with my book. And I'm like, the hell are all these people doing here, right? So I sit down at the table and I start signing books. And out of the corner of my eye, I spot this guy in line. And he's got my book clutched against his chest, and his face is buried in the floor, and he's walking really slow, and his hair is greasy, and his t-shirt's dirty, and his sweatpants are ripped. And I'm like, I wonder what's up with this guy. So I follow him all the way in the line. He gets to the front of the line, puts the book on the table, looks me in the eye, and says, "Me too. Me too." Now, you remember how I said I had no idea what the rest of my life was going to look like? Well, that guy showed up at that book signing to deliver a spiritual message of 2 simple words: me too. Well, you know what happened after that? I got completely run over by people. Everywhere I went, 5, 10, 15, 20 people were coming up at every book signing, every speaking engagement, every workshop that I was doing, and saying, "Hey, man, I read your book. You told my story. Me too. Hey, I saw your documentary. You told my story. Me too. Hey, I read an article in a magazine. You told my story. Me too." So something that I thought was uncommon is very common. And in the 16 years I've been out on the road doing this, I've had over 1 million people either directly or indirectly say those words to me too. And, you know, as I was healing myself from trauma, you know, there's that saying, you know, when the student's ready, the teacher appears. Well, I've had many, many teachers appear along the way. And some of the most brilliant, bright, smart people in the field of trauma, psychology, psychiatry. And I would basically Velcro myself to these people and say to them, "Teach me everything you can about trauma, mental health, and addiction." And so basically I've been studying human behavior for the last 20 years. And I've come to the conclusion that every single issue we have in society starts with unresolved trauma. Every single issue in society starts with unresolved trauma. And, you know, I've done almost 1,000 speeches on the subject. You know, I've spent $1 million on therapy. I've done 10,000 hours of therapy. I've done every kind of therapy known to mankind. Not only because I wanted to get better myself, but I wanted to experience what was out there so that when people came to me and asked me for suggestions, I could say, well, try this or try that or whatever it is.
Fascinating testimony, Shawn. I mean, I feel all kinds of things, anger, joy that he found God. You know, it's just sad that this is happening in the world today.
Well, you know, what jumped out at me is just the numbers, right? And he's just talking about sexual abuse. So he said 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys, by the time they're 18, are going to have at least one unwanted sexual experience, which will cause trauma. Now, I mean, he started off just coming from a traumatized family. And, you know, so he's experiencing trauma as a child, but it's because his parents also experienced trauma as children. Yeah. And we just seem to be in this broken cycle where there's so much hurt and so much trauma, and yet he's telling us the answer here, and that is he gave it over to God, and that's what made the difference. And I think there's 2 main takeaways here is first of all, I think we need to understand that as a society, we have more trauma than we understand. Like, so when he's saying, you know, all of our issues come from trauma, I think there's some truth there, because we get traumatized, we start reacting to that. People that suffer addictions, they've been traumatized by and large. So, and yet, you know, the answer is turning to God and starting to tell your story. I mean, it's almost like we're in the book of James. I mean, you tell your story to someone. As in, you know, it was meant more as in a confession thing, but there's something about being in a safe place and being able to tell your story completely honestly. For him, it was freeing. He had held that secret for 27 years, you know, and in shame that he found safe spaces to start sharing it. And I think that's part of the answer.
You know, the interesting thing is that what is the hockey organization actually doing to protect children? Because one of the things that he said is when he was 15 is when he basically got taken away from his parents and put into another situation, another home, and joined up with, you know, another coach. And that's where he started being traumatized. And I want to know, what lesson has the hockey world learned from this, and what are they doing to protect children and helping adults in their world? Because last night there was a hockey game, and they were celebrating Pride last night at the hockey game, and I can't put the two together. I'm going, on the one hand, you know, we know that there's an organization here that's targeted children. We know this because of what's happened in our schools. We're not giving away any secret here. And yet, you know, we're kind of promoting it on the hockey scene. And yet then we hear a testimony, a story like this. I have a hard time connecting the dots.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had a different witness on day one. I know her first name was Karen, an expert in child abuse. And, you know, usually you know the perpetrator. It's like a family friend or a relative that has gained the trust of the parents. Like, you know, when you're talking 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys, this is a significant figure. And Alan, I don't know what the answer is. Except that we need families to start turning to God, fathers to start turning to God, because then the whole family follows.
Well, yeah, it does boil down to, like our verse, the earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord. And we need the Lord. We need to get back to God. And of course, this testimony highlights that even more when they hear tomorrow's testimony as he continues on. But I just pray that the world will start to wake up and kind of like smell the roses. And you can't have it both ways. You can't be celebrating on one hand and then trying to correct it on the other.
I agree with you, and I also don't think you should hold back on your thought of what's the NHL doing, what's the WHL doing, what are all the hockey leagues out there doing to protect children? Because Alan, we don't see that this is a problem in the NHL. We hear about soccer coaches, male soccer coaches all the time, never in the NHL, and I never even thought it was possible. But now that we know. This is a problem, especially when everyone's coming up and saying, me too, me too, me too. That must be shocking, and it's absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah. I would have liked to have asked him the question, the Me Too's, have any of them been hockey players as well?
Or sports, yeah.
Yeah, sports of any kind.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he gave the figure, that basically 1 million people have communicated to him one way or another. Me Too, which again just reflects how traumatized as a society we are.
He said 10 million survivors.
Yeah. Well, when he did his numbers, yeah.
Yeah.
Shawn, we really appreciate having you on. We're going to do part 2 tomorrow because he also has an interesting story of what happened during COVID and how that affected him as well. And, and I love the ending part of his testimony tomorrow, part 2. It's fascinating.
Tomorrow, it's a real twist.
Twist.
When he starts telling you about his next trauma and you realize, wait a second, I experienced the exact trauma that he's talking about, but I didn't characterize it as trauma. I didn't characterize it as abuse. So, yeah, I hope all your viewers watch tomorrow's or the next show. It's going to be fantastic.
All right, Shawn, we'll have you back tomorrow. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I do encourage everyone to come and watch the show tomorrow. The second part of his testimony, fascinating. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint. God gets the glory in all this mess.
Amen.
Yeah. You want to know more about us and support our mission? You can go to our website, gotalktruth.com. You can click on the donate button. That's how you can give digitally towards keeping this kind of truth on the air, airing these NCI testimonies. If you would like to support us through the mail, you can. You can make a check payable to Heritage Christian Ministries Association and send it to 246 Stewart Green Southwest, Suite 3260, Calgary, Alberta, T3H 3C8. Or you can do it online, and you can also get prayer through our toll-free number, 1-800-915-0056 in Canada, 1-800-445-3450 in the U.S. All right, Dad, we're out of time. We'll see you guys later.
Love you.